Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, I guess, in some places. Thanks for being here today. We are here with Sara DeRoo. And did I say that right? I hope I did.
Yes. Yeah.
Good. All right. And she's gonna her talk today is on finding hope after systemic bias toward adoptees. And she's gonna talk about her own personal journey. We do have a bit of housekeeping in case there are any of you who are here who are continuing education credits. Remember that you have to have your real name on screen. You have to be able to, have your face shown and all of those things. And if the session is being recorded, remember that's something that you need to capture as well for your CEs. And we are recording today this event up until the Q&A. So that's our plan. Okay. And let's just introduce you very briefly to Sara. She is a licensed clinical social worker who resides in Tampa, Florida. She's an adoptee, transracially adoptive parent, and former foster parent. She has reunified with her family of origin and enjoys a strong but complex relationship as the eldest of 10 full siblings. Holy smokes. As
It's a reunion story.
as well as her adoptive family. Sara works in foster parent recruitment and retention and as an adoption competent therapist. She has recently published a book co-written with her son Desmond, who was adopted from foster care. He is now an adult who wrote his portions from his incarceration in Michigan. Their dramatic story is the basis for the session today. She enjoys music as her first degree was in piano performance, and loves being married to her second husband, Jamie, who is a professional bass player. Together, their yours, mine, and ours family then led them to late in life adoption of a son from foster care who has defied all predictions for his health and recently participated in the World Series of youth baseball this summer. That's awesome. Sara loves to learn and is supportive of all people who find themselves struggling for social justice and takes seriously her assignment as an adoptive parent. Sara believes love multiplies and doesn't divide, and loves relationships with her children's first parents and welcomes all in the constellation. So, all right, Sara, go ahead and take us on the journey here today. This sounds like an interesting one.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Jean. I appreciate your help with facilitating and moderating. We have a small group, which I won't lie, I kind of love that. I will say I don't see anything in the chat. I've kind of hovered my mouse around. Maybe if I get rid of the okay, maybe I will. So since we're kind of in a small and intimate group, I do you can put questions in the chat. I'll be checking it later. We will have a Q&A later. But I'm probably going to go ahead and just begin. And thank you for being here. If you don't mind putting in the chat kind of what brings you here, maybe what part of the constellation you're in, whether you're an adoptee, an adoptive parent, a foster parent, a first parent, an ally. It could be so many numbers of things. Please put that in the chat so I can peek at that in a little bit. So, good afternoon and welcome. I need you all to settle in. I hope you have your comfy slippers on and maybe some hot cocoa or tea or something, because I'm going to be this is going to be kind of story hour. I'm going to be doing quite a bit of reading to you, but with a twist. And so I'm going to start out here. This is written by Desmond in 2015. I'm in a space about the size of a small closet. The moon casts a small glow through the tiny window cut into the cinder block wall. I can't blame the light for not wanting to be anywhere around here. The four once white walls tell a story of lost souls, from dates and initials scratched in to Bible verses written across them out of some kind of desperate hope. I'm lying on a metal bunk bed, looking at a rusted toilet and sink squeezed in the corner. A window about the size of a small picture frame is built into the slightly rusted door. A thin layer of dirt and grease is caked over the door from years of people clawing at it. I imagine them staring through the blurred window at nothing at all. I'm deep in thought. The other day I was watching the University of Michigan versus Hawaii football game on TV. Every time the camera panned out to a view of the hundreds of students cheering in the student section, like in some kind of parallel universe, I'm standing in the crowd, cheering along with my dad in the stands of the big house. I snap out of it. I'm nowhere near the big house. In fact, I don't think I could be further from it. I sleep mere feet above a convicted murderer. He has spent the last 30 years in the place I currently call home, Chippewa Correctional Facility, a prison that is part of the Michigan Department of Corrections. For a while, my mom has been urging me to write a book with her. While I thought it was a good idea, I struggled because most books have happy endings. I felt like it would be impossible to write a book about my life when I'm not in a storybook ending type of place. But mom, being mom, wouldn't let this idea slide. The title she wanted was Loving Desmond. What made this complicated is that for my whole life, I have never really loved myself. We all have life-changing moments. For me, watching that football game was a profound life-changing moment. I could see a trace of a life I should be in. Maybe the best way to learn how to love myself is to tell my story with my mom, all while my dad is watching from the real big house, right along with God. So these are the words from Desmond, and he wrote it from a prison cell, and it started the telling of our fantastical journey from connection to fracture back to true connection. First of all, I want to say this needs to be a safe space. It needs to be a safe space for me and for all of you, because we tell our truth. It's a messy truth. The themes that are captured are hard. Okay, so Desmond was adopted from foster care at age 5 and is now age 30. And I wish so much he could be here. I think I'm going to throw a link later on into the chat where we were actually able to do a podcast with Beth Syerson and her Unraveled Adoption, so you can really hear his voice. And I think it was a little bit illegal, I won't lie, but he did. So we were determined to have his voice present and not just the book form. So I'll put that link there later. But this book was an extremely important project that began with the words I just read to you. Like he said, I was kind of like, let's write a book, because he's writing me from prison. Like, I've got nothing to do. Let's write. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, he sent me those words. And after I think I stopped crying for about 2 hours, I wrote back, and then he wrote back. And that's kind of how the book was created. So we shared our things. I want to say very honestly, we are raw and honest in the book. Just listening to Astrid and her amazing keynote, I'm like, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have said that in the book, or I shouldn't have said this or that. But the truth is, what we write about was where we were at during that time. This is the late 90s, early 2000s in terms of the time of his actual first adoption. And so we need to be forgiving of ourselves that maybe we weren't always so perfect all the time. And I might do things differently now than I did then. I'm sure Desmond would say the same. But this is our book. Our agenda today really kind of plainly is the introduction we're doing now. We are going to name the problem, kind of what happened, the whys, what we see as the whys. I have a little activity later, and then I'm gonna leave you sort of in the dark place. We are gonna land on hope before we end. I promise you that. All right. So here's a picture of Desmond at the graduation of his older brother from college, Garrett, and then his younger brother, Brian. And Desmond actually here in this picture is just, I want to say, he's just out of his first time in prison. And so we have this real dichotomy of, Mr. Successful college graduate, basketball player, older brother, We've got younger brother who is just about to enlist in the army and kind of had his path. And then we have Desmond in the middle. So, we're asking kind of really what happened. And that's a big part of looking at the systems here. So, like she said in my introduction, I'm Sara DeRoo. I'm an adoptee. And I see our history definitely through a trauma lens. But during this presentation, I'm not going to talk a lot about trauma. The book does that a lot, where we're looking at everything. So we focus on that in the book more, but I want you to understand that everything I say and do is kind of through those glasses, because it has been incredibly traumatic for Desmond. There were parts that were traumatic for me, and even in fact, the whole family. But we're going to look at the systems that affected him and myself and really the whole family constellation, and how intentionally hurtful some of those systems were, or even sometimes what we like to call benignly neglectful. Like they weren't trying to be hurtful, but by their neglect of knowing different things, they did hurt. So Desmond, we adopted Desmond originally. We had 5 other children we had adopted transracially before we adopted Desmond. And then through a variety of, I always hate saying that because I feel like I sound like, one of the collector people that we, as a social worker, I'm just like, can't handle, but it wasn't. It was like there were different stories about how each child came. There were a couple of what I like to call surprise adoptions, where we were called and said, hey, would you, here's a relative, would you, so somehow we ended up with 5. But for myself as an adoptee, I could not stand the idea of any child languishing in foster care um, that didn't have sort of a family claiming them. Of course, they have biological families, but by the time a child comes to that situation, they've already been through a lot. So we made the decision to seek a child. We were thinking around that age, because in the picture that you see, Taylor or Garrett, actually, with the graduation cap on, he was feeling at the time very sort of put out, because we had 2 girls and they were sort of like thick as thieves, and then we had 2 little boys who were like twins, and then Taylor's in the middle. He's like, I want a brother to play with. I want somebody that is for me. Like it's something like, because these girls aren't going to do it, nor are these little toddlers. And so it was much on behalf of that, as well as philosophically, always having wanted to adopt an older child. So gonna move ahead. All right. So we started the process, and this, sorry, it's a little blurry because it's a picture of an old picture. This is the very first picture we ever saw of Desmond. He's precious 4-year-old Desmond. He's posing to be photo listed. You can tell he's got a little action figure in his hand. He's got this sort of wry smile on his face. You see his brown curls and his big brown eyes. He was at that time, we were in Michigan at the time, they had what they called the MARE book, MARE, which stood for Michigan Adoption Resource Exchange. It's still there. It's sort of the state vehicle to help recruit parents for kids who have been in foster care, whose parental rights are now terminated, and they didn't have any other identified families. So now they have to recruit for these children. So they published that what they called the MARE book every month. It was this thick, it came to you like a catalog of waiting kids. And even thinking about that is awful. It's all online now, of course. But you can still look at waiting kids. In that case, it would be mare.org, and see the children who are in this sort of predicament. But there was Desmond. And I don't know how many of you know, so I'll just give a quick rundown. So when a child is brought into foster care initially, their bio parents or first parents are given, or their guardians, it may not even be their first parents, are given a parenting plan that they have to complete. And that is based on whatever the situations are that brought the child into foster care. For instance, if it was substance abuse or drug addiction, the parent may have to go through rehab or substance abuse counseling. If it's physical abuse, it might be anger management. It's supposed to be crafted toward the situations to help kind of repair. And by statute and law, the goal when a child comes into foster care 99% of the time is reunification. So everything is going toward bringing this child back with their bio parents while they're in foster care, and there should be visiting that's occurring and all the things. Now, usually that plan is supposed to be, it's different depending on the state. Typically, I would say between 12 and 18 months is kind of the norm. But there's times where the parents can't complete the plan. And there's so many reasons for that, we could do 4 sessions on that. But when that doesn't happen, then it's sort of like the goal changes from reunification to adoption. And the first choice would be, if they're not already placed with relatives, to find a relative placement. If they can't find a relative to adopt them, they hope the child will be able to remain in their same foster home that they're currently in. If that foster parent wants to adopt, if the foster parent can't or doesn't want to adopt at the time, that's when the child becomes available to be recruited for in the greater public, or to be in the mayor book, as Desmond was. So I'm going to read a little bit about what was happening then. And this is my voice. 1998, the call. The phone rang, interrupting the hum of fans attempting to push away the late August afternoon heat. The maple trees were shyly showing the start of their fall colors in our quaint neighborhood. Home alone while my husband worked, I ran downstairs to grab the call before it woke up 3-year-old Terrell and his toddler brother Brian, just asleep for their naps. "This is Desiree, Desmond's adoption worker. I see your inquiry on him," she began. "Are you interested in hearing more?" My eyes grew wide and my heart pounded. Why was Doug never at home when I got these important calls? I rushed to find a paper and pen and returned to the phone with one of those skinny grocery shopping list pads, the only paper I could find nearby, and I began to fill page after narrow page as Desiree shared the framework of Desmond's short but really tragic life. I needed to capture every detail to share with Doug. Desiree spoke confidently and quickly. Desmond had survived a difficult first 5 years of life. From birth to his most current reports, he had experienced 8 foster placements. He witnessed domestic violence. He was a victim of physical violence, suspected emotional abuse, and neglect. Yet she described him as funny, smart, and mostly well-behaved. "Desmond likes to make his own plans," his foster mother had reported. The sentence puzzled me, and I made note of it. "We need to know if you wish to move ahead before we share the full disclosure information," Desiree stated. "Yes, absolutely. We'd like to learn more," I responded, answering for both Doug and me. "We can move forward to set up a visitation after you read the documents," she said. "You need to assess whether you feel like you could meet his needs." A few days later, Doug and I received the full disclosure documentation containing his life thus far. It was a thin envelope containing a 4-page cursory child assessment. It didn't cover much more beyond what his social worker had already shared. Desmond was classified as having no or mild issues in all the categories, including health, cognitive development, and behaviors. He was seen to be a pretty easy kid, which surprised us. We had prepared ourselves for more difficult behaviors from our training classes in older child adoption. Doug and I felt no hesitation. We wanted to meet Desmond. Our first visit with Desmond was arranged for the early fall, a month after the initial call. Having been through the adoption process 5 times, Doug and I had developed some patience with the wait. We had already completed the required and specialized home study the year before, in 1997, after discussing adopting an older child from foster care. The home study analyzed our motivations to adopt in every aspect of our family histories, our lives from childhood through adulthood. We wrote our biographical histories explaining the dynamics in our families of origin and our relationships with our parents and siblings. We provided financial statements. Social workers visited our home. We underwent interviews about our experiences parenting our children, including our discipline practices. We submitted numerous required references from people who knew our family and could speak to our character and ability to parent. We completed FBI and local clearances, which included having our fingerprints run through national databases. Our home study also included a big focus on training. We read assigned books and attended hours of classes to prepare adoptive parents to meet children's needs. We prepared for the behaviors our child might have developed as coping strategies due to the abuse or neglect that led to the tremendous loss and complexities of their out-of-home placement. The stories we heard from experienced foster and adoptive parents in the classes were sometimes a bit shocking. Somehow, though, we didn't think they would be reflective of anything we might go through. On a sunny September day, Doug and I arranged for my parents to watch our other 5 children and excitedly drove to the local adoption agency to meet Ms. Burke, our local foster care adoption worker. She would meet us there and join us for the 3-hour drive to meet Desmond in Detroit. She greeted us dryly and sat mute in the back seat, tense, mouth tight, and eyes suspicious. To say Ms. Burke hadn't taken much of a shine to us in our adoption process would be an understatement. A seasoned African-American social worker who knew her stuff, she'd seem reticent to help us with any of our previous inquiries over the past year to adopt an older child. She appeared just as reluctant to work with us on Desmond's match. Not that she wasn't professional, she just seemed passive. In our other children's adoptions, the social workers provided encouragement and warm camaraderie. Ms. Burke was nothing like those other workers. Today, she seemed a bit left of her usual neutral, almost angry. While Doug busied himself with the task of driving, I prattled on about our other adoption experiences in an attempt to fill in the yawning gaps of silence. My nerves were jangling. Ms. Burke occasionally nodded, but offered no conversation. Doug patted my leg as a way of saying, "Don't bother." I clammed up and rustled through my purse looking for gum. "How much in subsidy do you get for the other kids?" she finally asked. Huh? I startled a little at her as her words broke the silence. I turned around to look at her, kind of surprised she initiated conversation. "I'm asking you, how much subsidy do you get?" she said pointedly. "Sorry? What do you mean by subsidy?" "Well," she said acidly, scanning my face, "an adoption subsidy is a monthly payment to help you raise the children you adopted from foster care until they're 18. It's based on their level of need. It's there to help encourage parents to adopt children who need homes. I imagine you get quite a bit with your other children." I kind of tilted my head, jaw open. I've never even heard of an adoption subsidy. Ms. Burke, with her eyes narrowed, took a long, suspicious look at my face. "So you're telling me you have all these kids and you don't get any money for them?" I said, "Honestly, no. Ms. Burke, seriously, I've never heard of this. In fact, we've kind of gone into a debt to adopt most of our children." I shot a sideways look at Doug, who took this in with raised eyebrows. Apparently, Ms. Burke, in all our previous meetings, thought we were adopting for the money, for a check. Why hadn't I picked up on this suspicion she had earlier? I could only imagine her inner conflict, being assigned to work with a family that she felt adopted innocent children for financial gain. She probably nearly hated us. Ms. Burke's face visibly relaxed. She even smiled a little. "Well, we'll see," she said. "But Desmond might qualify for a little subsidy since he doesn't seem to have any significant needs." The mood seemed to exponentially lift in the car, and she continued talking away like we were old friends for the rest of the drive, making jokes and calming our nerves for our first visit with Desmond. We arrived at Desmond's foster care agency located in what looked to be a depressed high-rise just outside Detroit. It sat next to a dated, nearly empty shopping mall. We parked in the parking garage and rode the tired elevator up 11 floors to the teen ranch, the agency handling 5-year-old Desmond's foster care and adoption case. The agency name seemed so out of place. I pictured a bright farm filled with animals and fields of wayward teens. It seemed anything but a child welfare agency situated in an urban setting. We entered the office, signed our names on the pad to check in, and proceeded to the cramped waiting room and settled on the plastic chairs. Finally, the window opened with a loud screech. Doug and Sara were ready for you. The receptionist led us to a conference room. We sat at the broad table and nervously adjusted the padded office chairs. Are you guys excited? Asked Desiree, grinning broadly. Oh my gosh, so nervous. I hope he likes us. You have nothing to worry about. Desmond is a sweet, sweet little boy. We were surprised he was still waiting, I said. We are so grateful you called us. He's so stinking cute. I said, oh, that picture doesn't do him justice, she said with a note of seriousness. Believe me when I say he is really handsome. As if on cue, the conference room door opened and Desmond came slowly into the room. He tried to hide behind his foster mother, Miss Greendown, a tall, elegant Black woman in her mid-60s with a commanding presence. My heart gave a jump at the sight of him. Desmond, slight in build, neatly dressed, as adorable as Desiree had promised, sat on his foster mother's lap. His soft brown curls framed his face, punctured with deep brown eyes. When we introduced ourselves, he smiled shyly at us for a moment, but quickly looked away. He glanced at the ceiling, the window, the table, the carpeted floor, everything but us. He nuzzled as close as he could to Miss Greendown. Based on his clear body language, we knew not to pressure him, so we chit-chatted with her. When Desmond seemed more relaxed, we started to talk with him, and I'm going to stop this reading here. There's more, but ultimately it took a long time to warm up, and Doug finally got him to warm up by we had a little basketball game, and Doug had brought cheese balls to eat, and Desmond started shooting cheese balls in the little basket, and he warmed up to us, and we decided to meet again and started that process to adopt him. So that's kind of how our love story began. But while we had our adult perspectives, Desmond had his. A child whose life was fraught with trauma, likely beginning in utero, with his birth mother and her own stress hormones coursing through her body during the pregnancy she was not planning on. He was brought into foster care system first at age 6 months because he was brought along on a drive-by shooting with his father in his baby seat in the back seat. And then he went back and forth 8 times, some reunification attempts, back and forth. In the book, we'll talk more about that. But then finally, here we are, coming before him, the picture that Astrid showed in her thing of her meeting her adoptive parents the first time. She's absolutely right. He had to be terrified, absolutely terrified, right? So now he's in this family and we're promising him stability and forever. And the rug is pulled out from under his feet when my husband Doug was killed suddenly in a car accident. And so his behaviors, despite all the help seeking that we sought from his placement, basically derailed to such a place that by age 13, in order for him to receive the mental health treatment he needed and for the safety of the other children in the home, I made the impossible and to this day most regretful decision of my life to terminate my parental rights. This book will tell that dramatic story in more detail. There's a picture of Desmond, by the way, the day we adopted him. And that's Doug Mason. So as promised, the title of this presentation is really, the systemic bias that adoptees feel. And we see this through Desmond's story really in so many of the situations, which might be extremes, but for most adoptees, they face them in some way, shape, or manner every day. So we're going to look at therapy, the therapeutic milieu. That was the first line of help that we sought. The inequities of racial injustice. And we'll talk about that, which was in the background, but it was always the drumbeat of his life, still is. the educational system, both local and at policy level, and finally, the juvenile justice or the justice systems from juvenile justice to adult corrections, which started for Desmond in the adult systems at age really 15. All right. So the therapeutic milieu, the historic perspective to current theory. At the time we adopted Desmond, RAD, or reactive attachment disorder, was sort of the darling of the diagnostic world for kids like Desmond, who had been through a lot of trauma and then were adopted. And there was sort of this whole constellation of symptoms that fit some kids and didn't fit others. It was just everywhere. There's still websites out there for parents who call, radish. As a therapist, I can't. I know it is a real diagnosis, but in current theory now, we see that most of these kids, it's really more post-traumatic stress disorder or chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. Some kids may have that reactive attachment disorder, but at the time that we adopted Desmond, that was pretty much everything was focused on that. It wasn't on the whole trauma-informed thing that we do now with Dr. Bruce Perry and Dr. Brian Post and all the different psychologists. It was rad, and all the therapies were kind of angled in on that. The interventions for RAD were entirely unsuccessful for Desmond. And I'm going to do a little reading about that for us. The more therapy we sought, the more Desmond retreated into himself. He avoided therapy sessions at all costs and protested when it was time to get in the car to go. He would arrive at the therapist's office with his hood pulled tight over his head. His bright brown eyes and little nose were the only parts of his face that you could see. I accompanied him to all his sessions. The therapist would call me in first to get an account of how Desmond's last week had gone. I would unload a litany of complaints, tattling, while Desmond stayed in the attached waiting room where the sound machine hummed its loud static to muffle anything he might be able to hear. The therapist would say, "So, how have things been going with Desmond this past week?" Me, "Not so great." Therapist, "What happened?" "He's refusing to listen or obey at all. When it's time to wake up for school, he refuses to go to the bus stop. He disassembled my clock radio, so I had to get a new one. I used your idea to get
Something
him
just
old
happened with your
appliances."
sound.
Really? Thank you. Can you hear me?
Now, there you go. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe it was a placement of my mic. I'm so sorry. Okay, so he's disassembling the clock radio. I used your idea of getting him old appliances at the Goodwill to take apart, but he doesn't care about those. He'd rather ruin something we use in the house. The therapist, "I see. What else is going on?" "Well, his sisters were mad that he cut off all their dolls' hair and drew all over their furniture with a permanent marker." "Oh my, I'm sure they were angry," said the therapist. "What did you do to discipline him?" Me, "Well, I tried a timeout, but he shouted and banged the chair into the wall, putting a hole in the wall. So I moved him to the step and he kept kicking at the banister until it became loose. So I just gave up and sat with him and tried to talk with him. He just kept saying, 'I don't know,' to every question I asked. Finally, I became too exhausted to care and sat with him to watch TV because at least I had an eye on him there." The therapist said, "Okay, Mom, so let's bring Desmond in for his part and see what he has to say." Desmond skulks in. "Oh, dear Desmond, I see you've ruined some of the books and toys I had in the waiting room. We're going to need to talk about that. Why did you do that?" Desmond sits in stony silence, his hood still pulled tightly over his face so we could only see bits of his eyes peeking out. The therapist, "Mom, why don't you pull Desmond close to you on the couch so we can talk together?" This was a big RAD intervention at the time. I'll just interject that to kind of force your child to be close. I attempted to draw him close, but Desmond pulled away and sat at the opposite end of the couch, as far away as possible. The therapist said, "How about we get out the sand tray? Would you like to do that, Desmond? We can work on your feelings." Rinse and repeat. This was our typical weekly therapy session. It was helpful for me to have a place to discuss my experiences in parenting Desmond with somebody I saw as an expert, even if only for the reflective listening she gave me during each session. Although Desmond's therapist was wonderful and skilled and made progress with most of the children she saw, we made no meaningful progress on Desmond and his issues. Despite all our efforts, Desmond's behaviors weren't improving. In fact, his daily challenging behaviors, lying, stealing, hoarding, and other sneaky actions continued to increase. One win, as I saw it, was Desmond was not as prone to huge blowups or violent outbursts. During his elementary years, his actions were more focused on petty theft and defiant behavior and refusal to follow expectations in the classroom at home. At home and at school, we continued to make attempts at logging Desmond's behaviors in a behavior log at school in the yellow, green, red card system. Every day there was daily behavior reports and calls and emails from the school. When those didn't work, the teachers turned to reward systems. For an hour of non-disruptive behavior, he'd receive a token, and after 3 tokens, he'd get a piece of candy or some other reward, but they all had little effect on him. So therapy with Desmond, this is just sort of a picture of those early years. It really kind of did nothing. I mean, maybe it did, I just don't know. But they were so unsuccessful. And into today, a lot of that continues, even in the therapeutic realm. You know, even as a social worker, I have worked with kids in foster care, like 3-year-olds that were on 4 different psychotropic medications. There's no way that, like, I don't even know where the child is anymore. You've got them so medicated. So we still are struggling in this therapeutic community. All right. Going into racial justice. Sorry, I changed the screen in there evidently. And do a little bit more reading. This just kind of sets the scene, I think, for my own. I knew about racism. I knew it was an issue. Obviously, we had a lot of training when we adopted transracially, which was amazing. But this is a situation where as we say in the South, I knew that I knew that I knew. So back in the early days of parenting, when we had just Kate, Cassie, and Garrett, my Asian daughter, my biracial daughter, and my African-American son, and all 3 of them were together, we were often identified as an adoptive family. We would hear remarks like, "Aw, what a wonderful thing you've done," which most adoptive families will tell you is not the best thing to say. The majority of us feel like the most really lucky people in the world. Our children are our biggest blessing. We don't adopt to be people's saviors, I'll say for most of us. Sometimes, though, there were hard real life situations. One of the first and hardest happened when my children were young, and it is seared into my soul. This episode forever changed my naive view of my children's societal acceptance. One morning I was shopping in Meyer, which is an area big box store. Kate, my Asian daughter, was at preschool, and I had my younger biracial daughter, Cassie, just 3 years old, and my African-American son, Garrett, 2 years old, in the shopping cart. They begged to look at the toys, so we strolled through the toy aisles, looking at all the things they wished for. A woman my age walked in with her child and the child's grandmother, so her mother. As we passed them, the older woman looked pointedly at me and said to her daughter, "Watch your purse." Time stopped. My eyes widened in horror and my face reddened, and I tried to make eye contact to say something in response, but the older woman turned away with a look of disgust. I went into flight mode, speeding ahead with my cart, and I left the store to the loud protestations of my children. My mind raced. Does she really think I'm going to steal her daughter's purse and go careening through the store with 2 toddlers in my cart? I was panting by the time I got to my car, and I buckled the confused Cassie and Garrett in their car seats. I sat in the front seat in some shock. I realized that my children will, because of their skin color, be seen as a threat. And I was typecast at that moment as probably a welfare mom, probably shacking up with multiple Black men, and probably a criminal by nature. Maybe I was even an addict, who knows? That grandma saw me, a young mother with 2 Black kids, and made many snap assumptions, ultimately deciding I was someone who wouldn't hesitate to steal her daughter's purse on a sunny day at 10 o'clock in the morning with my 2 toddlers in tow. I cried my eyes out for my children and all the other children and parents who face this sort of discrimination every single day of their lives. Racism and discrimination came for us that day. Our little town was no longer the safe bubble I had hoped it would be. This was a lesson in the school of hard knocks for me. I now knew the reality that my children would face based only upon their physical appearance. It's not a stretch to see Desmond's interactions with authority figures as a child through the lens of race. I wonder if some of the bad choices leading to his incarcerations were in part an unconscious retribution for the way he is seen by so many, a fulfillment of their negative expectations of him as a Black man. So, and I will tell you that this clearly continues today. Now we need to hear from Desmond. Okay. There are going to be parts of the readings I'm going to do from Desmond right now that I'm going to, I don't want to say apologize in advance, but prepare you for. There is one that does use the N word because that is his real word. And I am not going to air quote whitewash what he says. These are his words and they deserve to be heard. So this one is from Desmond. After he went to live with his aunt and uncle following, he was ordered to a residential treatment in Iowa for a year and came back, and his aunt and uncle became his foster parents. And so this is, and they were really in an all-white community. The community we lived was quite mixed, but this one is really an all-white small city. Desmond says being the only Black person in the household was hard because now he didn't have his siblings. He's got his cousins who are white. This translated to every part of my life, even the simple things. Even getting a haircut showed cultural differences. My aunt took me to Great Clips the first time I had my haircut when I lived with them. This lady cut my hair without considering that everyone doesn't have the same grain or type of hair. Halfway through the haircut, she commented to another stylist that she should have charged more because my hair was nappy. Being a kid, I was too intimidated to defend myself and respond. The remainder of my haircut, I felt like I was being abused as she jerked me around like I was a bobblehead, not a teenage boy. When we made it home, I immediately went to the bathroom and dug out the hair clippers. Hearing my clippers, my cousin popped his head in. He asked what I was doing. I just got a haircut. When I responded, I needed to line myself up because the barber didn't. He laughed and said, "What the hell is a lineup?" I explained that lining myself up or a lineup was when you use the trimmers to go across your whole hairline to make it straight, even, and clean. I continued telling him this makes the haircut have more of a groomed look, especially when you line up behind the ears and the back of the head as well. I went on saying they make certain trimmers just for this. The look I received was one of confusion. Once again, it felt like I was in another country speaking a foreign language. I resented this town more and more. That year was hard for me. Starting high school for the first time halfway through the school year was brutal. I was the new kid. I was the Black kid. I was the bad kid. I became numb to dealing with cultural differences daily. Hearing exaggerated, "Yo, yo, yo, what's up, my nigga?" from white people who'd never even been around Black people was normal. Being the token Black kid was the reality I experienced. Every music conversation had to be about rap because in their minds, all Black people listened to was rap. They didn't know that my first love was the guitar, and I would watch Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix to get away. Every time they churned chicken at school, it became a Black joke. The nonstop racist remarks and jokes caused me to become bitter. I started isolating myself and doing bad in school. Eventually, I started playing into the Black stereotypes because I wanted to fit in. I was tired of walking the hallways alone during lunchtime because no one would eat with me. I wore my clothes baggier and I talked in slang. I became someone I wasn't in order to fit in. And I think we can see in Desmond's words here, kind of what Astrid was talking about when she was doing that developmental thing in that middle school age is that's where all we want is to fit in. And Desmond was having to co-opt his self to do that. Desmond words are so powerful in this space. I'm gonna read a few more. This one was when he sent this one to me, this one nearly cracked me. So this is when at this point where my rights are now terminated for Desmond. And he writes, Desmond, no last name, just my first name and a question mark. It was my first day at Zeeland High School, and I was in the principal's office because of signing my papers with that name, his name with a question mark. The first couple teachers didn't say anything, but by afternoon it generated so much buzz that they sent me to the principal's office for a wellness check. An older woman with a warm smile introduced herself as the school counselor and came into the office lobby motioning for me to follow her. I sat down in her cramped office across from her at the desk, and I remained quiet as she got on the computer and pulled up a document with my name on it. Desmond, what's going on? She asked, almost shocked. Why are you signing your name like that? I sat there quiet, contemplating what to say, before quickly saying, because it's the truth. Her shocked look became animated. I know your aunt and uncle personally. They're great people, she told me, exasperated. Why would you say that? You know my aunt and uncle, like you stated, ma'am. But with all due respect, you don't know me. If you did, you'd know I'm an orphan and legally the state of Michigan is my mom and dad. So if I don't have a mom and dad or a family, how can I have a last name? She reminded me of a fish as she kept opening and closing her mouth, trying to word a response. Knowing I had a valid point and not trying to cause myself any more pain, I stood up and walked out of the office toward my class. On the way to class, I stopped in the restroom to splash some water on my face to stop the tears from crawling out. As I looked in the mirror, trying to gain composure, life struck again. My eyes focused on a message scrawled on the side of the mirror. Fuck niggers, go away. No one there. You know, as a transracial adoptive mom, I do feel like I did my best as a white woman to raise my children as well as I could do as a white woman, to raise them with a sense of pride in their culture and ethnic heritages. I always believe it's the onus of the adoptive parents of transracially adopted children to make it their work and mission to celebrate and intentionally seek role models for their kids. In my household, we did attend the culture camps. We had family friends of all races. We had babysitters that looked like them. Our house was full of Asian and African American art and books. We celebrated Kwanzaa and the Korean holiday of Chuseok and many others. I went through the intensive program of the Institute for Racial Healing. My children participated in everything. So it's almost breathtaking. It's kind of like what we did as a family. It was like some families go camping or fishing, just like we did cultural awareness. All of this to say I was unable to protect my children from the greater societal negative influences of racism. No matter what I did, and the stories I still hear boggle my mind. My Black sons were stopped for driving while Black. And Desmond was the hardest hit as we look later with the subject of the justice system. I got to watch my time here, guys. All right, so earlier I spoke about benign neglect, and I want to define that a little bit more. Essentially, I see it as almost, quite honestly, an outcome of ignorance, meaning just not knowing. So in the educational system, it seems like we saw a lot of that. His early experiences in elementary school with teachers who at the time had no training in working with traumatized children, or even children who didn't come from then two-parent families, negatively impacted the students. His first kindergarten teacher insisted that I bring in, when they were doing those exercises where you have the baby picture and then try to guess whose baby picture it is. Despite trying to get baby pictures of Desmond, writing his former foster parents, I got no baby pictures of Desmond. And she sat on the phone and argued with me back and forth that maybe I could just cut a picture out of a magazine, or maybe bring a picture of one of his younger siblings, of other siblings. Just ridiculous. And she would not budge on it, would not budge, would not change the assignment at all. Later on, public policy took a huge role. And to be honest, I'm going to take the moment to read this, because this is one of the most critical junctures that if the policy had turned left instead of right, the trajectory of Desmond's entire life may have changed. So Desmond at this point had actually come back to live with us even after I terminated my rights, after a year in adult jail at 15. And I wrote, Desmond looked forward to attending high school with his siblings. But when we went to enroll him a few days later, that door is shut in our faces. Michigan, with its 4-year ticking time clock rule for completing high school, burst our balloon. Desmond started his freshman year in the neighboring district with his aunt and uncle, but then the clock paused while he was in county jail for a year. The rule dictated he must attend the district alternative high school until he achieved full credit recovery, meaning that he had earned enough class credit to be a sophomore, or I think a junior actually at that point. He could then transfer to the traditional high school. We both stared at the registrar as she delivered the news. Well, there's nothing she could do to enroll him. Nothing. I'm sorry. She handed us back his registration paperwork. We go into the car to VR Tech, our local alternative school. I felt a growing sense of dread the closer we got. I knew what attending this school would mean. Desmond's peers would be kids with similar behaviors to his. The kids he met in juvenile detention and who belonged to area gangs would be his classmates. The teen boys and girls who pushed back on rules and expectations would be his next friends and role models. My hope for a fresh start quickly began to deflate. He could not participate on the football team or in the school clubs that he wanted to. Even Des seemed to know that this would not end well. He looked at me with a blank expression as we went to the floor to enroll him. So, and true enough, I want to say 3 months after that, Desmond tested positive for marijuana, and the judge, losing all patience with him, sentenced him to adult prison. Desmond's thefts, just so you know, by the way, were primarily theft and stealing tools out of people's garages. Not necessarily physically violent. So injustice. How are we doing on time? I would love to do some more of these readings because these are very strong readings from Desmond. He started in juvenile detention a few times. Like I said, he went to Iowa for a year, came back for about 6 months, then went to adult jail for a year, home for 3 months, back to adult prison. And it was really hard. Adult prison is no place for a 16-year-old. And Desmond eloquently writes about those experiences for him. If you would just take just a second and think about those things: therapy, school, the justice system, racism. If you've been personally affected, can you list them in order of significance, kind of the most to least? And then if they haven't affected you, kind of list them in order of what you think they might have been for Desmond or other adoptees or foster youth.
Okay, Sarah, my tired brain. Can you give me the 4 again? And I will
Sure,
put them up for everybody.
absolutely.
Sorry.
So, well, and you can just write therapy,
Yep.
Racism,
Yep.
education, and then I would just put justice, meaning juvenile justice or adult corrections.
Thank you, ma'am.
Absolutely. Thank you. While we're working on that, do any of the themes in this book, I guess, resonate to any of you, or do any of you have any questions you want to ask? I'll open the chat again. Education, therapy. Mhm. Thank you. You can feel free to come off mute if you want. If you have any questions, we can stop recording, I think, for here.